If every empire eventually collapses, what makes us think the dollar will be any different? The world runs on green paper, a piece of cotton, ink, and faith. Faith that this symbol, born in 1776, can still command oil, gold, and governments. But faith is fragile. And today, from Beijing to Brasilia, from Moscow to Riyadh, a quiet rebellion is taking shape, one that aims to end the dollar's reign. Some call it de-dollarization, others call it inevitable. But the question remains, is the death of the dollar truly coming, or is it just another doomsday myth? This is Biz Knots, where money, power, and history collide. Today, we trace the life and supposed death of the most powerful currency in human history. The US dollar isn't just money. It's a mirror of American influence, a weapon of policy, and the bloodstream of the global economy. It's what nations use to trade oil, what corporations use to borrow trillions, what investors retreat to in every crisis. And yet, every few years, headlines scream, "The dollar is dying." They point to China's yuan, Russia's sanctions, digital currencies, and gold reserves as evidence of the dollar's decline. So, is it really dying? Or is the dollar, death, just another myth that resurfaces every time the world gets nervous? To understand this, we have to go back, not to Wall Street, but to a small hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. Because the story of the dollar's power began long before crypto and BRICS. It began when the world lay in ruins, desperate for order, and America was the only nation left standing. Before we can talk about the death of the dollar, we need to understand its birth. How a single meeting, 75 years ago, turned the American dollar into the beating heart of global trade, and how that very success planted the seeds of its own vulnerability. Let ES go back to 1944, the moment the world handed America the keys to the global economy. It began not with Wall Street, but with war. By 1944, Europe was rubble. Cities like Berlin and Warsaw were bombed flat. London was drowning in debt. Asia was still burning. But across the Atlantic, the United States stood untouched. Its factories humming, its gold vaults full, its navy patrolling every ocean. America held 2/3 of the world's gold supply. In real numbers, about 20,000 metric tons, stacked in places like Fort Knox and Manhattan's Federal Reserve. The world needed a new financial order, and America was the only country strong enough to design it. So, in July 1944, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered in the quiet resort of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission was audacious: rebuild global finance from scratch. The British delegation was led by the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes, the man who had once rewritten economic theory. He arrived exhausted, ill, but determined to preserve Britain's waning influence. The Americans were represented by Harry Dexter White, a tough, pragmatic Treasury official, younger, shrewder, and backed by a far richer nation. Keynes wanted a global currency called the Bancor, a neutral unit that no nation could control. White wanted the dollar, and in the end, America won. The Bretton Woods Agreement created the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and, most importantly, a system that tied every currency to the US dollar. Each country would fix its exchange rate against the dollar, and the dollar would be convertible into gold at $35 per ounce. In effect, the dollar became gold. The world's trade, debt, and savings all ran through Washington. This system wasn't just about economics, it was about trust. Trust in the stability of the United States, in its political institutions, in its military, in its promise to defend the free world. The dollar was no longer just a currency. It was the backbone of the post-war order. And for nearly 3 decades it worked. Western Europe rebuilt under the Marshall Plan. Japan rose from the ashes. Trade boomed. Living standards soared. As long as the dollar was as good as gold, the system thrived. But behind that golden promise, The math was already starting to break. In the 1950s, the U.S. had more than enough gold to cover all the dollars in circulation. But as the Cold War escalated, America began spending on defense, on Vietnam, on social programs, on everything that projected power abroad and prosperity at home. By the 1960s, the world was flooded with dollars, far more than America's gold reserves could support. Economists called it the Triffin Dilemma. To supply the world with enough liquidity, the U.S. had to run trade deficits. But those very deficits would eventually undermine confidence in the dollar. It was an impossible equation. The more the world relied on dollars, the less stable the dollar became. By 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle called America's system an exorbitant privilege. He demanded gold for France's dollar holdings, and even sent a battleship to collect it. Between 1958 and 1971, foreign central banks drained nearly half of America's gold reserves. The trust that once seemed eternal was beginning to crack. August 15, 1971. A Sunday evening, the world's televisions flicker to life as President Richard Nixon addresses the nation. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Those words would change the global economy forever. Nixon called it temporary. It wasn't. The dollar was no longer backed by gold, only by the full faith and credit of the United States. To some, it was an act of betrayal. To others, it was a masterstroke, a way to free America from the constraints of a dying system. But it also unleashed something new, a world where money was no longer anchored to metal, but to trust alone. After 1971, the question was simple. If the dollar wasn't backed by gold, why would anyone still use it? The answer came not from Wall Street, but from the deserts of the Middle East. In 1974, Washington struck a quiet deal with Saudi Arabia, the largest oil producer on Earth. The arrangement was simple. Saudi oil would be priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, the U.S. would provide military protection, weapons, and political support. Within a few years, every major oil-exporting nation followed suit. Thus was born the petrodollar system, an invisible architecture that tied the world's most essential commodity to the American currency. Oil-importing countries had to earn or borrow dollars to pay for energy. That meant keeping dollar reserves, buying U.S. bonds, and participating in America's financial orbit. The result? A perpetual cycle. Dollars flowed out of America to buy oil and flowed back in as foreign governments reinvested in U.S. Treasury bonds. It was a brilliant, self-sustaining loop, one that turned the dollar into a global monopoly of necessity. This new system did something remarkable. It allowed the U.S. to run deficits without consequence. America could print dollars at will, knowing the world would keep accepting them. The gold standard was replaced by a trust standard, and as long as the world needed oil, it needed dollars. For the next 5 decades, this invisible pact underwrote American power, from global trade to military expansion to the rise of the consumer economy. The dollar became the air the world breathed. Every empire creates its own logic and its own weakness. By tying global trade to a single nation's currency, the world became hostage to America's choices. When the U.S. raised interest rates, other nations suffered inflation. When the U.S. printed money, others imported debt. The dollar wasn't just a tool of trade, it was a tool of control. In the 1980s, Latin America's debt crisis showed what happened when that control turned toxic. Countries borrowed in dollars, then watched their currencies collapse as U.S. rates spiked. Millions were thrown into poverty, while Washington dictated the terms of recovery through the IMF. The same pattern repeated in Asia in the 1990s, in Europe during the 2008 crisis, and again when the Federal Reserve began tightening after COVID-19. The heartbeat of capitalism kept pulsing, but each beat sent shockwaves around the world. The irony: the very system designed to stabilize the world has become its greatest source of instability. And now, after 80 years of dominance, that heartbeat is faltering again, challenged by rising powers, digital currencies, and the erosion of trust. So, yes, the dollar once died in 1971. It was buried under gold and resurrected by oil. But every resurrection carries its curse, because when a currency becomes too powerful, it stops being just money and becomes a symbol. And symbols, like empires, don't last forever. In the next chapter, we'll see how that symbol is being challenged again by China, Russia, and a world tired of playing by America's rules. The age of the petrodollar is fading, and a new order is quietly emerging. But can the world really live without the dollar? For half a century, the dollar's reign seemed untouchable. But power rarely fades with a crash. It erodes, grain by grain. In the 2000s, as America fought wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, another kind of conflict was brewing, one over money, not territory. China's rise changed everything. In 2000, China accounted for just 4% of global GDP. By 2020, it was over 17%. Its factories became the world's workshop, its trade the world's lifeline. Yet nearly all that trade, even Chinese exports, was priced in US dollars. Every year, Beijing sent real goods out and received green paper in return, and that paper was mostly recycled into US Treasury bonds, lending America the very money it used to buy Chinese products. The world's greatest creditor was funding the world's biggest debtor. It was a strange marriage of convenience and suspicion. China didn't trust America's political system. America didn't trust China's ambitions, but both needed the dollar to keep the machine running. And then came 2008. The collapse of Lehman Brothers was more than a banking failure. It was a crisis of faith. The same dollar-based system that promised stability had nearly destroyed itself. Trillions evaporated. The Federal Reserve printed $700 billion overnight to rescue the system. For much of the world, that moment was a revelation. The U.S. could create money from nothing, and everyone else had to live with the consequences. Countries from Russia to Brazil began asking the same question. If the dollar can be weaponized, should we still depend on it? In 2009, the BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, announced plans to explore trade in their own currencies. At first, it was mostly talk, but a decade later, those talks became deals. China and Russia began settling oil trades in yuan. India and Iran used rupees. Brazil and China signed a currency swap line worth tens of billions. None of this killed the dollar, but it sent a clear message. The world wanted options. Then, in 2022, that quiet rebellion exploded. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. and its allies froze over $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves, assets held in dollars, euros, and pounds. It was an unprecedented financial strike, and it sent shockwaves far beyond Moscow. For decades, foreign nations had assumed that their reserves, their savings, were untouchable. That illusion died overnight. If Washington could freeze Russia's money, what stopped it from doing the same to anyone else? Saudi Arabia noticed. So did India, and especially China. In 2023, Saudi Arabia hinted that it might accept non-dollar payments for oil. For the first time in nearly 50 years, the petro in petrodollar wasn't guaranteed to mean US. Meanwhile, the BRICS bloc expanded, adding Egypt, Iran, and the UAE, countries that collectively control a third of global oil output. They began speaking of a BRICS currency. Even if such a currency never materializes, the narrative itself matters, because power begins as perception, and perception can move markets faster than any army. The data tells the story. In 2000, the US dollar made up 72% of global foreign exchange reserves. Today, it's just under 58%, the lowest in modern history. That decline isn't sudden collapse, it's slow decay. Central banks around the world are diversifying, buying gold at record levels. In 2023 alone, they added over 1,000 metric tons of gold, the most since 1950. And for the first time, China's digital yuan began testing in cross-border trade. The shift is quiet, deliberate, and relentless. But before we declare the dollar dead, we have to ask, what does the world replace it with? Because removing the dollar is easy in theory, but rebuilding the system without it is a different story. Here's the paradox. Everyone complains about the dollar's dominance, yet no one can live without it. The dollar is the system's greatest flaw and its greatest glue. More than 60% of global debt is issued in US dollars. About 90% of foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar. The SWIFT network, the plumbing of global finance, routes most international payments through US banks. And when investors panic, they don't rush to yuan or euro. They rush to US treasuries, pushing yields down and prices up. That's not just habit, it's architecture. The dollar isn't T-dominant because it S-loved. It S-dominant because it S-embedded. Every multinational corporation, every commodity trader, every central bank uses it as the unit of account, the medium of exchange, and the store of value. It's the language of global finance, and languages don't die overnight. So what keeps the dollar alive? One word: trust. Not trust in perfection, but in predictability. Investors may question Washington's politics, but they still trust America's courts, its contracts, its capital markets. The U.S. has the deepest bond market on Earth, over $27 trillion in Treasury securities, with liquidity that no other country can match. The Eurozone is fragmented. China's capital controls prevent free flow of money. Even if the world wants to move away from the dollar, there's simply nowhere else to go. In finance, liquidity is power, and the dollar remains the ocean in which every other currency swims. Economists call it the network effect. The more people use something, the more valuable it becomes. Think of it like the internet. It works because everyone's connected. The dollar works for the same reason, because everyone else uses it. Breaking away means higher transaction costs, volatile exchange rates, and political risk. So, despite the complaints, most countries choose stability over sovereignty. They criticize the dollar by day and buy U.S. bonds by night. Even China, the loudest advocate of de-dollarization, still holds more than $700 billion in U.S. treasuries. Because in moments of uncertainty, the dollar isn't just a currency, it's a lifeboat. French leaders once called it America's exorbitant privilege. The U.S. can borrow in its own currency, run trillion-dollar deficits, and still have the world lend it money. But privilege is a double-edged sword. Every crisis abroad drives the dollar higher, making U.S. exports less competitive and global debt harder to repay. A strong dollar hurts as much as it helps, and if that strength ever turns into arrogance, it becomes a weapon against its own allies. That's why the real threat to the dollar isn't bricks or gold or crypto. It's America itself, the erosion of the very trust that built the system. When Congress flirts with default, when the Federal Reserve floods markets with cheap money, when partisanship replaces policy, each crack in governance weakens the foundation of the dollar's credibility. Because in the end, money is a mirror of the society that issues it, and the world is watching that reflection carefully. The truth is, the dollar's death won't look like an explosion. It will look like erosion, a slow, silent redistribution of influence. Maybe more trade in yuan, more settlements in euros, more central bank digital currencies. The dollar will shrink from hegemon to anchor, still vital but no longer singular. We may be entering a multipolar currency world, one where several systems coexist. But even there, the dollar will remain the reference point, the compass others navigate by. Because the world doesn't just need a currency. It needs trust, liquidity, and law. And for now, the United States still provides all three. So no, the dollar isn't dead. It's aging, yes. It's challenged, yes. But it's far from finished. Every empire's currency carries its moment of doubt. The pound, the franc, the guilder. It will fall to the same thing that killed every empire before it: complacency. And that's where we'll go next, to the heart of the storm, the coming crisis that could finally test the limits of the world's faith in American money. Because even the strongest currencies eventually face their reckoning. The end of a currency empire rarely comes from outside. It begins within, quietly, invisibly, as confidence turns into entitlement and discipline turns into debt. America's greatest advantage has always been its credibility. The world trusted the dollar because it trusted American governance. That trust was built on three pillars: fiscal responsibility, political stability, rule of law. Today, all three are under stress. In 1980, the U.S. national debt stood at under $1 trillion. By 2000, it was $5 trillion. By 2020, 27 trillion by 2025, over 34 trillion and climbing by 1 trillion every 100 days. Each administration promises discipline, but both parties spend like tomorrow will never come. The result? America now pays more than $1 trillion a year just in interest, more than it spends on defense. That's the cost of borrowed credibility. Debt isn't just numbers, it's time. Time stolen from the future to pay for the present. For decades, foreigners bought U.S. debt because it was risk-free. But how risk-free can something be when its own issuer debates whether to default every election cycle? Every few years, Washington stages the same performance: threats of shutdown, warnings of default, last-minute deals. Markets hold their breath, and the rest of the world watches, not the numbers, but the chaos. Because instability, even if temporary, erodes faith. A superpower that can't manage its own finances looks less like a leader and more like a liability. The irony? The dollar's strength often rises in those crises. Not because the U.S. looks strong, but because every other option looks weaker. It's a paradox of modern finance. America profits from global fear, even when it causes it. But history shows that kind of privilege never lasts forever. After the pandemic, the U.S. printed over $5 trillion in new money. For a while, it felt painless. Markets soared, consumers spent, unemployment fell. Then inflation hit. Prices climbed at the fastest pace in 40 years. The Federal Reserve raised rates at the fastest pace in modern history. Mortgages doubled. Business credit froze. And the rest of the world saw what the strong dollar really meant: a global squeeze. Because when the Fed tightens, it's not just America that feels it. Every emerging market that borrowed in dollars suddenly pays more. The world's financial pulse still beats to Washington's rhythm, even when it hurts. That's power, yes, but also responsibility. And responsibility, when abused, turns into resentment. The dollar's greatest strength is not its design, it's its story. The story of America: innovation, openness, reliability. But stories, like currencies, must be renewed. When inequality rises, when infrastructure crumbles, when trust in institutions collapses, the story starts to fade. The world doesn't need America to be perfect. It just needs it to be predictable. And predictability is exactly what's slipping away. Because if America can't govern itself effectively, the world will eventually stop letting it govern their money. That's the quiet revolution underway, not with tanks or treaties, but with trade invoices and payment systems. Every empire faces a moment when its currency stops reflecting its greatness and starts reflecting its excess. The Spanish silver, the British pound, the Roman denarius, all fell not because of enemies abroad, but because of corruption within. The dollar's future depends on whether America can remember that fiscal credibility is national security. Because in the 21st century, wars aren't just fought with weapons, they're fought with spreadsheets. So, is the dollar dying? Not yet, but it's aging, and like every empire before it, the question isn't if it will fall, it's how gracefully it will decline. Visuals, montage of historic currencies, Spanish real, British pound, US dollar, dissolving into one another. The dollar will not vanish in a single crash. It will evolve into a world where it shares power, not commands it. A world of multiple anchors: dollar, euro, yuan, digital tokens, perhaps even gold again. The greenback will remain the reference, but not the ruler. The 20th century was defined by one currency. The 21st may be defined by competition among many. That's not collapse, it's correction. And in that correction there's opportunity. For the US to rebuild trust, for nations to regain agency, for investors to diversify beyond nostalgia. Visuals, AI data centers, satellite networks, digital wallets, gold vaults. Because money, like power, never disappears. It just changes form. The next dollar might not be paper or even a nation's currency. It might be a digital standard, decentralized, programmable, borderless. But whatever form it takes, it will still need the same three things the dollar once offered. The dollar's story is really the story of faith. Faith in systems, in governments, in ourselves. Every generation believes its currency is eternal. Every historian knows it isn't. But endings are not failures, they're transitions. When the British pound fell, the world didn't collapse. It adapted. And someday, when the dollar's time comes, the world will adapt again. Because history doesn't end with decline. It reinvents itself through it. The question isn't whether the dollar will die. It's whether America will have the humility to prepare for what comes next.